Tatro. It's June 29th, 2010. Jim, when did, well, let's start this. Jim, tell us a little about your personal educational background.
Well, I was born and brought up in Manchester and went through Manchester Public Schools. And I went to Harvard to get an undergraduate degree in history. I stayed there for an additional year and got a Master of Arts in Teaching. After I was hired here, I picked up another master's degree at UConn.
So you came back from Harvard, and did you get hired directly?
I got hired directly at Manchester High School. I loved it there, teaching freshmen. But after my first year, I got bumped to the junior high school when the system reorganized. After a couple of more years, I decided I had enough of public education and left to go to work at the Etna. So that when the college was opening in the summer of '63, I was not teaching, and I was working elsewhere full time. My seventh grade teacher, who later was my assistant principal at Bennett, I saw earlier in the summer, and he suggested I might be interested in this new community college. And I made contact, and a very steamy August afternoon, I was interviewed by Fred Lowe. And I'm not sure why he picked me, but I suspect that it was the Harvard degrees on my resume, the fact that I had teaching experience but wasn't teaching and could therefore devote my energies much more focusedly.
So college was relatively new at the time.
College didn't quite exist at the time.
And it was going to be housed in Manchester High School later in the day?
Right. We ran from 3:30 to 10:30.
Did you feel that it was a risky move to move from Etna, which was certainly established MCC?
Well, I taught part-time for a year and a half. And before I went full-time in the spring of '65, Fred Lowe asked me that very question. He said, "Are you sure you want to make this move? You sure you want to give up your day job?" The continuance of the college was by no means certain at that time. But I made the move and never regretted it.
Now, you came here to teach what subject?
History. I was the history teacher for basically the first 2 years.
What were the students like? This was during the escalation of the Vietnam War.
Well, this was before that. The first group of students had some of the same demographics that were typical through much of the college's history. In one of my first classes, there was a gentleman who was 76 years old. There was a mother of a student that I had when I was teaching in high school. There were a lot of kids who had not been in college prep programs, who were not not prepared. There were people who had flunked out of other schools and were back for another shot. Generally, the overall complexion of the student body led to a situation where high school faculty were not too sympathetic. They had had these kids previously, had shown no signs of motivation to learn, and now we were using the same resources to give them college courses. It just didn't seem right for many.
What was the college like in the early to mid-'60s?
A lot of changes took place during the mid-'60s. The first year, there was only Fred Ramey as the full-time faculty member, and everybody else was part-time. But we operated as if we were the faculty. Fred Lowe called meetings of our faculty. We operated with very little space beyond the classrooms. Fred Ramey was housed in what had been a book storage closet. Fred Lowe's office and the admissions registrar office combined was in a room that had been a private red room at the high school. When I went full-time in the spring of '65, I was entitled to a office, and that turned out to be a room that was used for early childhood education, but it wasn't used 2 afternoons a week, and I had a desk in there, not secure, but I had a space supposedly for office hours. The next year, when we had new faculty coming in, they carved out office space for 3 of us. It was in what had been a towel room next to the boys' locker room, and these were relatively long and narrow, what you might describe as stalls rather than cubicles. The year after that, the college leased a building on East Center Street, and then my office there became. My office was located in the kitchen of what had been this old, rather nice house, but had been not occupied and had kind of gone to seed. The following year, excuse me, the following year, when we acquired the use of the building that had been the headquarters for the Hartford Electric Light Company, the Helco building on Hartford Road, very dramatic changes occurred. And we had been, for 4 years, we had been strictly in late afternoon, evening college, a night school. Now, with our own facility, offering classes from 8 in the morning until 10 at night, became a very different kind of place. It was our space. We weren't sharing it with the high school, although half of our classes still remained at the high school because the building wasn't big enough. The building itself was marginally suitable for a college classroom building. The rooms were large enough, most of them anyway. The biggest complaint, though, was the heating system, which blasted away, and we had to open the windows in the middle of winter to keep it livable. And then, of course, it was not air conditioned, and so in the late spring and summer and early fall, it was very uncomfortable. It made some changes for faculty who now had classes that conceivably stretched over the 10-hour day. They might have morning, might have evening classes. They might be at Manchester High School. They might be at the Hartford Road building.
Was during these early years, was there a sense among the faculty and administration that we're building something, we're creating something essentially from nothing?
Certainly, I think that was the sense, especially the first couple of years. Within 2 years' time, the college had become essentially unwelcome because we were using more space. We were not meeting the budget contribution that the town expected. And so they became increasingly anxious to get us out of there. For a while, we were, kind of in a situation where we were uncertain about what our future was going to be, simply in terms of facilities. Things changed dramatically when the state took over, but still the tension between the use of the high school building by both the college and the high school continued.
Now, you were here, were you still here when they developed the East Campus?
Oh, yes. It was unbelievable. The fact that we would have our own campus, that we didn't need the high school anymore. I mean, the East Campus looked like, the Valhalla to us. I mean, it was, it was in the eyes of the beholder, it was a gorgeous place. And the expectation would only be there for no longer than 10 years because permanent buildings would suddenly spring up. One of the big problems for teachers and for students was the scheduling of classes both there and at the Hartford Road building, and the shuttling back and forth in 10 minutes time between classes, both by students and teachers, was an interesting kind of situation. But by that time, I had kind of moved into an administrative role. And so those kind of concerns were less central to me than they were to people who were teaching full-time.
Who were some of the people who made an impression upon you during those first 10 or 12 years?
Well, in addition to Fred Lowe, obviously, Fred Ramey. Fred was the first full-time faculty member. He was responsible for building a lot of the career programs. And I would say next to Fred Lowe, he was probably the most influential person on the development of the college within the first 10 years, probably. I was fortunate in being able to do most of the hiring. I went from being the full-time history teacher to being the only teacher in the social sciences, so kind of by default, I became the department chair, and in those days, we did the hiring. The president, might pass on it, but but he wouldn't hire without us, and almost never questioned those that we selected. I guess the earliest person to come on board full time was Dick Day. I had known Dick from high school, when we were in high school. I think we were at Bennett for a while together. And he started part-time, I think, in the fall of '64. And we're fortunate to be able to bring him on board in '67. Other early people were Dave Gidman. I think he was the first person that came into the social science area that had a college teaching background. One of the interesting things about the start of the college was that none of us had college teaching backgrounds. Myself, I was called upon to teach a course that I'd never even taken in college, let alone taught at the college level. That changed over time, obviously, and more of our faculty did come with college teaching experience.
Did Mary Ann Handley come on during this period?
Mary Ann Handley was a friend of mine since first grade. She had applied for the part-time teaching job the same time I did, and for whatever reason, I was hired rather than she. But she came aboard part-time, I think, maybe 65, 66. And then I was able to hire her full-time in '68, I believe. Sid Lipshars was also an early hire. Ken Steer was an early hire. Eleanor was hired part-time in the mid-'60s and came on full-time a couple of years later. That seemed to be kind of a pattern. And it worked out well because we had a chance to make sure there was a good fit. And most of our hiring decisions were pretty good, I think.
Now, when you moved into administration, you were responsible for developing programs in community service area. Could you talk a little about that? Yeah,
that was, I guess, my third career at the college. My first being a teacher, the second being an academic administrator, and community services was the third and final one. In the spring of 1972, Fred Lowe approached me about taking on a new role. And I blew them off. I had no desire to move out of the social science division, which I had largely built, and which was a very congenial, very collegiate, very collaborative kind of organization. The summer session of 1972 went quite badly, I guess, and that was the real impetus for Fred to push very hard.
Badly as in poor enrollments?
Yeah. At the time, summer sessions were funded out of the general fund, and the objective was to meet the SCH quota, and that didn't happen. So Fred went to me, partly because out of the social science division, we were already involved in off-campus kinds of things. We had administered the prison program that Jack James had got funding for. We had been doing some work for the Department of Alcohol and Drug Dependence Division of the Mental Health Department, and from there we got involved in starting what became the Drug and Alcohol Rehab Counselor Program. This was still in social science. And I think the other thing is we were involved in the new careers program with the community renewal team. The program consisted of students working in the mornings, mostly for state agencies, and in the afternoons attending classes. And that was a terrific experience for us. Finding a space to locate our classes was an adventure. Diane McCutcheon, who was working with me at that time, scoured the city of Hartford. Those churches who were receptive were so well programmed that they didn't have the space, and those that did have the space didn't really want to bring in a large group of minority students. Interestingly, we ended up on the Friends Meeting House in Quaker Lane in West Hartford. It was on a bus line, and that seemed to work fine. We had to go in every day to convert the room, which was used for a preschool in the morning, to college classrooms. The population there were exactly 100. There was 1 white, 9 Hispanics, and 90 blacks. And the rapport that we developed with that group was very interesting. The program went well. We got through a year, and then the funding was pulled. We did get some of those students to come to campus, though. One of the more amusing moments in that program was when students were confusing my wife Candy with Diane. Diane's a good 10 years older and about 6 inches taller, and because this kept happening repeatedly, I made the remark, "Yeah, all us white folks look alike," and that just exploded the room, and made things very congenial after that. But I'm digressing, obviously. We were involved in this program while we were still part of the social science division. But we'd had these kinds of experiences, and so I guess there was a logic in us moving off to kind of focus on these, but also to handle the summer session. And because the summer session was the paramount thing, our original name was the Division of Summer Session and Extension. We did somewhat better in the summer of '73 than had occurred in the previous year. We came within 3 of our SEH targets, so we were golden. In the meantime, we attempted to start a non-credit program. a couple of times that had been attempted without very much success. Again, Diane was the person primarily in charge of that. Our problem was then, and I guess has continued through the present day, the lack of space for non-credit programming. What space there was obviously went to the credit program first, but nonetheless, we did get a viable non-credit program off the ground.
Now, as I recall, you were also involved in extending the credit courses to area businesses such as Pratt & Whitney and some of the insurance companies.
Yeah. The starting point was with Pratt & Whitney. After Fred Lowe retired, he went to the Board of Higher Education office for a few months. At least there was some question about when exactly he was able to retire, and because of the mix-up, he had extra time to do. And one of his assignments there was to put together a group on continuing education and business. And he asked me to serve on that. And from Pratt & Whitney was a fellow named Tom Furtado, and his comments during the course of the session was that he had looked all over, he had approached all kinds of colleges, and nobody was interested in working with them relative to their apprentice program. They had an extensive program in, I think, 3 or 4 areas, more than the equivalent of a year's instruction. But neither the tech colleges or the state colleges or anyone else was interested in dealing with that. But I happened to be there at the time and suggested that we might be interested at MCC. And out of that came the program at Pratt & Whitney that was held on site. It was a major program for us. We later on brought Eastern Connecticut State University into that program as well, so it was possible for Pratt & Whitney employees to earn both an associate's and bachelor's degree right on site. Before I left, they wanted us to do most of their non-credit programming as well. So, it was a very good, positive relationship that got us a lot of publicity and made us more credible to other organizations. We could work with Pratt if that got recognition. I think one week it appeared in Business Week that we were doing this. We also programmed at the Aetna, at what was then Connecticut General, Cigna, and what was then again Connecticut Mutual. That kind of contract program was in addition to grant-funded programs that we were doing. There was a Model Cities program that we were doing in Hartford. We did some WIC programs, Women and Children. We also started doing public programs off campus, that is tuition-supported programs. The largest and most successful one was in Vernon. We started at the high school, but they had to do some renovations, and they bumped us to the Vernon Middle School, and that was a great place. It was convenient access. It was non-intimidating, and we attracted lots of people who would not have come to the college except by starting there. We also programmed in South Windsor, briefly in Bolton, and I think in East Hartford at Penny for a while. In addition to the off-campus program, we started a weekend college. And for a time, we were offering classes on Friday night, Saturday morning, Saturday afternoon, Sunday morning, and Sunday afternoon. And again, that was well received. One of our innovations that is so commonplace now that no one thinks of it was once a week evening classes, or once a week classes. Prior to the 1970s, the only once a week classes were available were for graduate students. No undergraduate classes at all. And there was some degree of disdain on campus here about, how could you possibly have any quality instruction occurring over that long a period of time? But, of course, now everybody does it, and no one even thinks about it. What can I say beyond that?
So, what year did you retire?
Actually, I left in 1983 without retiring. My contributions to the college were recognized by the Board of Trustees by naming me Emeritus, even though I wasn't retired, and I think I was 47 at the time. So I consider myself part of the institution, even though I moved on. Went to the Aetna Institute, Aetna Institute for Corporate Education, which was a very exciting place that was largely a community service continuing ed operation, but with the Aetna funding behind it and gorgeous facilities, and able to, from my role there, to increase the Manchester program substantially, to bring in Greater Hartford for one program, to get Aetna in Middletown hooked up with Middlesex Community College. In the 3 years that I was there, I learned more about higher education than I had while I was employed here, simply because I became the Aetna's liaison with higher education. Our involvement, or my involvement there, and organizing a joint advisory committee between the senior executives of Aetna and the college presidents and system heads was a very positive thing for the community colleges, because in that environment, anything other than Trinity or Yale or Wesleyan was not considered, worthwhile. But when I left, I hired Ron Clinton from the college to be my replacement, becoming the advisor for Aetna students who were interested in pursuing college.
So you were connected with the college basically for its first 20 years?
First 20 years, right. When I left, I was the last person who had been employed in 1963. And, of course, now I'm the only one living from 63.
Who were some of the key individuals during those 2 decades who really had an impact on you in the college?
Well, there were some interesting years when Ronald Dennison was president. We did not always agree, and when I had the temerity to tell him to his face things that he was doing were not good, that got me in trouble. Obviously, in fact, at one period I was so stressed out that I was hospitalized for a short time. But I made a lot of friends, I think, at the college. People who have been in touch with over the years. People in the social science division, like Dick Day, like Howie Bergman, like Steve Casano and Mary Ann and Eleanor. People beyond that, yes, I interacted with. I think we have people from most of the academic divisions participating in community service programs of one kind or another. In terms of my my administrative colleagues, Bob Finn was my supervisor at a couple of times, he and I did not always agree, and generally did not serve as an advocate when he was supervising community services. But in terms of individual relationships, personal relationships, we always had good ones. There's so many people that, to come up with a list. People who worked in community service who left when I did, like Kim Milling and Gary Van Voorhis in the drug and alcohol program. Also, again, people that I work with from other divisions, but who had the most, I don't know, probably Fred Lowe. Fred paid me the ultimate compliment, I guess, in 1984 when the Lowe building was dedicated. He was speaking about the danger of having acquired permanent facilities, gorgeous facilities compared to what we'd had, that we not lose sight of where we had come from and what we had been doing. And he hoped that the departure of several individuals would not retard that. Harry Godey had gone to Capitol. Bob Fenn had retired, and I had left. And Fred singled me out as the person who was most influential in making the college what it was over the first 20 years. So yeah, I have to return the compliment in the sense that it was his vision, his style of management that encouraged people to experiment, to create. And I'm not sure the college has been the same exactly since he left.
Looking back at your time here, what accomplishments are you most proud of?
Well, like I said, I think I essentially built two divisions, doing most of the hiring in the social science area and working with a number of people to develop new curriculum within the social sciences. While I was in charge there, we started geography and anthropology. In fact, for a long time, we were the only college, community college in the state to offer both. Philosophy was also developed. The First Our Summer Session program was a great success. After the 72-73 year, our salary funding was switched from the general fund to the extension fund. So, in essence, we had to support ourselves. We had to generate enough income to carry us through. And when salaries were increased, it was a mixed blessing for us because we had to generate more business in order to support the salaries that we had. So the phenomena in the late 70s was that we were growing. We were growing personnel-wise and program-wise, while the rest of the college was suffering from very tight funding and was not growing. And obviously, that made those of us in the continuing community services division not exactly well thought of, or not that we're taking anything away from anybody, but just that we were doing well.
If you were talking to a person who had just been hired by MCC to begin his or her teaching career this fall, what would you tell that individual?
Well, my most recent teaching experience probably was in the early 90s, so I'm totally out of touch in terms of being able to make that, give that advice. One thing that was present from the very beginning was that we were expected to teach college courses, that there should be no differentiation between college courses and community college courses. And that was kind of difficult when you were failing a whole bunch of students who were totally unprepared and totally unmotivated. That got worse as the Vietnam War did heat up, and people seeking college deferments to stay out of the draft. When I taught later on, I found more and more legitimate students, well-motivated, well-prepared students. There was a time when you could safely say that if you had evening classes, they were going to be much better in terms of student population than daytime classes, but I think that's changed back and forth over the years as well. My advice, though, would be simply to not view these students as any different than you would other college freshmen or sophomores. An interesting flip side to that was the experience we had with some high school teachers who came in expecting that our students here would be much brighter and much older than they were a year before, and that caused some problems. We had a student who was just out of graduate school teaching a psychology course for us at Pratt & Whitney at one point, and her attempt was to teach everything she'd learned in 4 years of undergraduate and year of graduate school in one course. That I'm sure had occurred elsewhere, but it's a concern to be addressed.
Are there any particularly funny, humorous situations or anecdotes that you can recall?
I don't know if I should mention them in this. I think the most famous ones was commencement of 1969. Fred Lowe, from the very beginning, hosted some kind of event in connection with commencement. After our first commencement in 65, he brought the graduates and their families and the faculty for a celebration at Cabby's. And as the numbers of graduates grew, that became a prohibitive kind of undertaking. And so he had parties at his house. And they tended to be pre-commencement parties. In 1969, the party was a cocktail party where martinis were the only beverage served. And that probably proved to be a mistake. Many people went to sober up after the party and the start of the ceremony, but others of us simply carried on at different venues. And we did not acquit ourselves very well. The faculty line marching into Bailey Auditorium was weaving back and forth, and many of us, I think, had very much difficulty focusing on the main speaker, who was Homer Babbage. There were other events as well that, in retrospect, were humorous in retrospect. But Ed Bollinger over at Hartford Road was carrying 2 trays of the data punch cards that had registrations or grades or whatever on it, and he tripped, and the cards went all over. And anyone that was more chagrined than Bollinger, I don't recall seeing. There was another individual who was spotted trying to use alcohol or Alka-Seltzer at a drinking fountain, and the frothing at the mouth that occurred was priceless. We had a lot of funny people. people with a sense of humor that carried over into all kinds of situations. After I left the social science division, we created what we called the social division, kind of a merger between the personnel and social sciences and community services for our off-campus gatherings, and that camaraderie continued.
We've covered a lot in the last 40 minutes. Is there anything else you'd like to relate about the college?
Well, I think it's a credit to the college that we survived for 18 years without our own facilities, as it were, and that we survived another 13 years before any permanent facilities. The fact that we worked under those conditions, the fact that we were always underfunded and lacked space, and it was a major credit to those of us who were here over the first 20 years or so. We never lost faith that we were going to come out all right. We were going to be a significant institution. In many ways, the creation of this campus didn't change a lot of things. I mean, I think the morale, the creativeness, the vision carried forward has to go back to the first 20 years or so.